Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a closer look at the image quality performance from the new Zeiss Batis 40mm f2 CF, or close focus lens. Now, if you'd like to know a little bit more about the lens and a little bit more about what that close focus is referring to, you can take a look at my first look episode where I break down the build and the design and the handling, and you can get more information there. Today we're going to take a closer look at the actual optical performance from the lens and run it through a variety of tests, both real world and kind of more formal tests, to see how it holds up in a number of different metrics. And so join me as we jump in and take a closer look at the image quality from the Batis 40mm f2. It is important to note that there is a bit of information that's built into the lens profile itself. I will note, however, and let's take a look at this full screen just so you can see what I'm talking about. I think that and I've seen this before with other Batis lenses, there is a bit of a tendency to overcorrect on these Batis lenses, and that if you look relative to the center, the edge is almost over brightened. And so, I wish that the way that they come into Lightroom, it's just a little bit overdone. Anyway, taking a look at a few other metrics here. So, obviously it's hard to actually look at, vignette because of that profile already kind of being built in. As far as the actual distortion, I see the mildest amount of, barrel distortion bulge that is there. But for the most part, we've got pretty straight lines, so I don't foresee any kind of real issue. As far as center sharpness in contrast, as you can see, is pretty fantastic. This is on a 42 megapixel Sony A7R Mark III. As we move off towards the side, you can see that resolution certainly hangs out to the side, but you see there is a little bit of reduction in contrast towards the edge of the frame. But we do have, even at f2, we have some resolution right into the corners. And I will also note that, as you can see, the centering on the copy that I reviewed seems to be good. I've had good success with that on the Batis lenses so far. And so all in all, a pretty sharp, wide open performance. Now, if we're to compare the f2 to the f2.8, what you're going to see here is that the f2.8 has a little less of that overcorrected look to it. This corner here compared to the center looks more natural than this corner compared to this center. And that's, it's more the nature of the profile, less a tendency of the lens itself. What we can also see is that there is a noticeable uptick, particularly in micro contrast at f2.8. And so you go from being sharp and contrasty to exceptionally sharp and contrasty in a notable way. And so there's just that micro contrast. The white looks whiter, the dark spaces look darker, and thus the resolution textures pop in a more significant way. Likewise here, just a bigger difference between dark and light, and thus your resolution on your corner textures look quite good. And so now resolution, I would say, at f2.8 is excellent right out into the corners, and so obviously a very strong performance at f2.8. Now f2.8 to f4. Now, I will note that the f4 image compared to the f2.8, it seems to me to be a more even across the frame illumination. And so I think that that's because we're getting a more natural, less of a profile correction, more of just a natural vignette lift. We already had basically perfect center performance at f2.8. f4 is a hair brighter. That's the only thing that I can really point to. Otherwise, both of them look exceptionally good. Out on the edge, there's a little bit better resolution. It is there. It's noticeable when you have them side by side. I am not sure that it would be noticeable if you were just looking at, comparing a field image. And so resolution is already great, and, it's just a hair better. Likewise, moving on to f5.6, a little bit more of what I said previously, in that we're just delivering a little bit more even, a little bit brighter look, progressively as we stop on down. Once again, in terms of, our raw resolution findings, I think you would be hard pressed to spot the difference. They're both very, very good. Maybe here on this left side, it's a little bit better at f5.6. So, take f5.6 to f8 as your peak apertures for landscape. Now, part of our reason for that excellent contrast comes down to a pretty strong control of any kind of longitudinal chromatic aberrations. Something like this kind of thing. This is ribbon and near a Christmas tree. This is something that would show a fair bit of chromatic aberration, and then looking on towards the bokeh circles, just really not a lot of fringing to be seen on them. And so, byproduct of this is that we can tell that our chromatic aberrations are well controlled. And look at how, very, very strong here at a close focus distance. And of course, that's part of the nature of this lens, is it's designed to perform well at close focus. But as you can see, the mesh of the ribbon, there's a lot of really great resolution there on that shallow depth of field. And so kudos to Zeiss, very good job of chromatic aberration control. Now here's another image that I know from experience is a nightmare for some lenses when it comes to chromatic aberration. I mean, you've got really, really shiny surfaces, and in this case, I actually illuminated this with really strong direct sunlight coming through a window. And so this is a pretty harsh environment for this kind of shot. This is at f2.8. And as you can see, chromatic aberrations are just really, really exceptionally well controlled. All those shiny surfaces, and yet we're seeing very, very little fringing. No purple fringing that I can see. The faintest bit of green fringing after the plane of focus, but I mean, not enough to do anything. I mean, you can see here's the sun coming through the window very directly into this shot. I will note that a very good application for this lens is if someone who does, say, food photography or product photography, where the little bit looser framing might be easier to use, like for something like this, than a macro lens, particularly one that's in the traditional kind of 90 to 100 millimeter range. And also, the nature of the lens is that you can get close enough to really, really nail down fine details like on this lens. But at the same time, and this was a handheld image, you can see maybe there is the slightest bit of motion blur on it. But you can see that there's lots of detail in all of those textures that are rendered. And, very nice bokeh rendering here as well. And so I think that's a good application of this lens. Low chromatic aberration, low distortion, very high sharpness, and the ability to focus down very closely definitely shows some of the strength of what you can do with this lens. So this shows how close you can actually get with the lens. This little blossom here would be a few inches around, and the stamen coming out of it, you can see that you can get that close, but then you can see that the actual detail rendering at a pixel level, 42 megapixels here, is really quite excellent. And so it's not, one-to-one macro type level, but certainly enough resolution there to be very useful. And of course, the ability to, as you can see, we are stopped down a little bit here, but the ability to really defocus a background. Now, this particular shot may not be quite at minimum focus. This is a handheld shot, and obviously with this kind of subject, you don't pressure luck too much, but I do think I'm pretty close to minimum focus here. And as you can see, if we go into a pixel level, really great detail on the details of this cactus here, and lots of detail in the spines. And so definitely does a nice job for that close focus type work. Now, the lens does something interesting when you get down towards minimum focus area, and so I wanted to point it out here. At closer focus distances, what you can see is you can actually see the aperture blades showing here. Now, that's not necessarily unusual. Zeiss lenses almost universally have a 9-bladed aperture iris, and so creates a nonagonal shape when stopped down, except, take a look over here. Technically, this is not stopped down. Now, I do want to point out that macro lenses, by their definition, by the physical aspect of every macro lens, when you get to minimum focus distance, the effective maximum aperture does close down. That's just physics. Now, what this lens does, however, is that in this kind of scenario, it does stop down a little bit. It's not a massive amount. It's to somewhere around f2.2, But even very early on, the lens will start to show the aperture blades. But the very fact that you can see something other than a circular shape shows that even though the aperture is showing f2, the lens has physically closed the aperture a little bit, and that appears to be part of the mechanism that enables the close focus ability of the lens. And so anyway, I'm not crazy about this behavior because I do like very circular aperture. And if you stop this down further, it's just going to become more defined. But that is a phenomenon that does take place here. Here in a secondary image, you can see I am not quite as close. I've moved a little bit further away, but we're still seeing the shape of the blades and the aperture still showing f2. And so we're talking feet away at this point, not inches away. And so that is something that it does. In this case, we can see I've moved a little bit further away from the subject. And so we've got a subject here that is perhaps 3 to 4 feet away. Looking at the bokeh highlights in the background on this shot, once again at f2, we can see that they are circular. And so the aperture is completely open at this point. But note that if you're very close to your subject, the aperture does close down a little bit. And obviously it physically closes down a little bit. And that causes the out of focus highlights to be a little less than circular. So if that's a big deal to you, you might want to observe that. Now, if you're talking about, non-circular bokeh highlights, as you can see, the actual bokeh quality here is really, it's quite nice. And so we're not quite minimum focus here, but obviously pretty close to our subject, these little blossoms here. So lots of detail on them, but then quite a lovely defocused background. And so nothing to complain about there. And then just to swap things and give you a look at the foreground bokeh. Foreground bokeh is rarely as smooth as, beyond the plane of focus, but, this isn't bad here. It's a different kind of look that I think is less visually appealing most of the time. But anyway, give you a look at that. And then, of course, on our subject, everything, it looks nice and sharp in terms of the detail there. Here's one more example. Obviously, I am pretty close to the subject here, but because the highlights aren't as bright, what you're going to find is that they look fairly circular. I think that this probably does have just a tiny bit. You can see just a little bit of the blade there, but I wanted to share this to show you that, maybe it depends on what your shooting style is. But for me, outside of Christmas time, I'm unlikely to get a lot of shots that would be objectionable with the lens. This also gives you a look at the keys here. You can see before the plane of focus, almost no longitudinal chromatic aberration. I mean, this is where the purple would be before the plane of focus. After it, we've got a tiny bit of green fringing, but yeah, very, very little. And so, for this kind of thing, it's melting away quite nicely. And obviously being able to get close, this is on an organ, it allows me to, do something creative here. And so I like that shot. So here we are at f2, Arizona sun in the frame. And of course, in Arizona, when you have the sun in the frame, it is a very bright sun. So what we see here is that we do have some localized kind of a veiling and a broad ghosting type pattern, kind of just more of a prismatic haze being produced, not so much of an actual, line of, circular or blobs of color shape being produced there. So, I mean, I wouldn't call that too bad. There's certainly artistic applications for a little bit of that. It never bothers me too much. Now with it stopped down a little bit, what we see is that we still don't have a clearly defined ghosting pattern. I think there is a little bit here, but obviously it's not all that destructive. What we have is a little bit more of that kind of prismatic effect. In some ways, that's almost kind of a retro vintage kind of effect, and that's particularly true like in a shot like this. You can see I've got a really bright side light coming into this room, and both in the color rendering and then this kind of side veiling type pattern, haze pattern, whatever. It's actually kind of cool. I think it's a vintage effect that I think has a lot of stylistic applications, particularly since it's doing that in a non-destructive kind of way. Here, obviously, we have a strongly backlit subject, and I can see that maybe in this corner we've had a little bit of a veiling type pattern, but overall, obviously, there's a light veiling across the frame, but On our subject, both contrast and detail have held up very well, and again, chromatic aberrations are really fantastically controlled. All of these spines coming off of this are, great places for CA and well controlled, so a little bit of that veiling, I think most people could agree that's stylish, so no problem there. So those attributes make this a pretty cool portrait type lens. As you can see here, even, looking at the various cacti and lines in the background, bokeh quality is pretty great here. And in this case, I've had to raise the shadows a fair bit because I didn't have a flash. This is a pretty strongly backlit subject, but even raising things up, detail is good. IAF works really well, and so a nice addition if you're a portrait photographer. I think this is a pretty good potential acquisition. Here's another shot just under house type lights, and so you can see IAF has done a great job, and this is at f2. Great detail on the face, and so yeah, I mean, nothing to complain about there. It's kind of a good general purpose people lens in general. I find the 40mm focal length, anywhere between 35 and 45 millimeters. I've used lenses in all of those. They really work really great for this kind of thing. This was a gift from someone in the church I pastor, and you'll see it in photos because it's a pretty cool little thing. And so the smile is genuine. I really like the gift, and this was my wife taking the picture, and so the fact that it produces a good result with my wife behind the camera, well, let's just say that speaks well of the autofocus capabilities of the lens. A few more images here to finish off. This is showing you more kind of stop down type lenses. I went to this event in Fountain Hills, Arizona while I was there, and while it was a little bit disappointing in that none of the balloons ever left the ground, you can see here that if we zoom in, this is obviously higher ISO settings, but the lens has captured a tremendous amount of detail. If you look across the frame here, lots of great information, and then zooming out, you can see that that is just a small center portion of the image. One final image. Here is a landscape type image, and so I just wanted to show you that it also works very well for that. It's a good focal length for a lot of things, and as you can see, right across the frame at landscape apertures, just great detail. I mean, look at how much resolution is on all of this information. This mesquite, you look at all the detail that's captured there, and its branches and whatever it has instead of leaves. And so just lots of great information here in the wildflowers in the foreground, and then off into the scene in the distance. Just, a great job, good color. Not quite Loxia good color, but, very good color. There's a lot of good stuff going on for the lens. So as you can see, there is really very little to complain about when it comes to the image quality performance from the Batis 40mm. Across the Batis series, I've been really impressed by the consistently excellent optical performance of those lenses. None of these lenses are cheap, and of course that's kind of the bottom line for people that are considering them. But at the same time, as I pointed out, as we looked at image quality, if you're someone that's looking at doing food product photography, or maybe you want a focal length for shooting general purpose type things, this is a lens that is really flexible. It's really flexible in terms of focal length, and then of course that close focus capability also improves the flexibility. Really the only downside that I could point to is that if you're put off a little bit by the aperture blade starting to show, if you're closer to a subject, there's fairly narrowly defined parameters, basically really bright circular lights where you're going to see that a lot. But if you do a lot of that type of photography, you might be put off by that one attribute of this lens. Outside of that, however, I saw nothing during the image quality segment that would discourage me personally, and a lot that would, make me interested in a lens like this. And so if you're looking for a lens that, might do some of the things I've talked about before, or maybe in addition as a portrait lens at that kind of focal length, it certainly is an intriguing one. We'll explore that a little bit further in our final verdict, which will be the final episode that is yet to come on that. I'll also explore the capability for video a little bit more in that, and we'll talk a little bit more about those things and wrap it all up in a nice package there for you in the end. In the meantime, if you want to look in the description down below, as always, I've got that image gallery going everything, and so you can check out images that I've taken during my review period. Beyond that, you can also follow my work and follow me on social media, now including Instagram if you want to follow links to that. You can also become a patron of this channel, and you can sign up for my newsletter if you want to stay informed of everything that's going on. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.